Talking about this development bank called the BNDES. This was wrote this with an eye on commodities and the way that commodities have played a historical role in the development or underdevelopment of countries in Latin America, in this case Brazil. So what is this bank, BNDES? Stands for National Bank for Social and Economic Development. It is currently the largest development bank in the world. 2010 disbursements doubled those of the World Bank, although it does engage in different types of lending. For instance, BNDES lends primarily to domestic projects within Brazil or to Brazilian multinationals operating throughout the globe, whereas the World Bank functions a bit differently. But nonetheless, I think that the numbers are impressive. It was founded in 1952, and since then you can't analyze Brazil's industrialization without looking at the role the bank has played. And then I also found it very interesting the way that the bank has frequently transformed itself, or policymakers have pushed it to transform, depending on whatever particular political economic paradigm was popular at the time. ISI, import substitution industrialization. BNDES was this typical ISI institution, this sort of state-led, industrialized policy, this kind of shortcut to industrialization. So the state was a really heavy actor. And when we had the transition to neoliberalism, where the idea is that the state really backs off and the state is just there to sort of provide support to the private sector, we see that BNDES is still playing a really strong role as a financier to the private sector and really dictating some of the actions of the private sector. Which brings us to now with the post-Washington consensus, Southern consensus. I don't think there's a name yet for where we're at, but BNDES in the 2000s, under Lula, now under Dilma, is playing a really strong role in Brazil's economy, as I'll discuss quickly. You see here the disbursements over the last 14 years have continued growing and growing. You see a spike in 2008, likely because of the financial crisis. Analysts have been saying that one of the reasons that Brazil was one of the last countries in the crisis and one of the first countries out of the crisis was because the bank increased their lending and was not willing to let the economy slow. Since then, it's sort of just kept going, which the critics in Brazil like to point out. But we can see also that, like coming out of import substitution industrialization, there is now a big emphasis on exports and diversified manufactured exports. And BNDES has been very instrumental in funding projects or funding businesses that export, funding innovation to create industrialized exports. So there's it increased 100-fold from 1991 to 2000. Currently, this Export-Import Bank subsidiary of BNDES is now at $13 billion. So since 91, it's increased 400-fold. And we see here a sample of some of the Brazilian multinationals that are operating throughout the world. There are in total 300 some. I don't have the number here. But, and they're from diverse sectors: pharmaceuticals, food, engineering, and, IT, pulp, paper, mining, chemistry, aeronautics. So there's a huge mix of primary commodities with highly specialized commodities. So that was the punchline. Now let me start back in the early 1900s. One of the reasons that BNDES came to be so prominent was that in the 1950s, after World War II, the Brazilian government was very eager to industrialize, overcome this legacy of dependency. They wanted to have a diverse economy. They didn't want to be one of the typical, fall into the trap that so many Latin American countries have of being a monoculture export, just exporting bananas, just exporting coffee, sugar, cotton. And so there's this very conscious effort to diversify industry, create infrastructure, and over the last 5-6 decades, there's been like Gisa was talking about very extreme projects to build highways, dams, hydroelectric stations, now wind farms, and so forth. So one of the reasons they want to overcome this legacy of underdevelopment, this remove themselves from reliance on primary commodities, as this quote from Stephen Bunker says, extreme periphery, there's a failure to develop in the extreme peripheries because of the low proportions of capital and labor incorporated into the total value of their exports, and because of the low level of linkages to other economic activities and social organization in the region. Basically saying that just investing in rubber or just investing in sugar is not going to trigger development. It's what Andre Gunder Frank referred to as the development of underdevelopment. So one of the reasons why these primary commodities never really trigger development is because there's volatile world prices. In the case of the Amazon rubber boom, if one country starts, like when Southeast Asia started producing rubber, it really cut Brazil out. There's extreme highs and lows in prices that Brazil has no control over, but have heavy ramifications for the Brazilian economy. For instance, even when the price is high, that should be good, but if the price is too high, then other parts of the world will start to develop synthetic materials to replace that, which can then severely harm Brazil's economy. So in the case of the rubber boom, it was heavily capital intensive, lots of sunk costs. The tappers received high wages relative to the immediate economy. And ultimately the profits, even though they were highly taxed before they left the country, the profits weren't really absorbed in the area of extraction. They just tended to be absorbed in urban centers like Manaus and Belém and Iquitos. So as Brad Barham in AgriCon, this is from a paper from him, claims that the biggest impact of the rubber boom for development was the development of some roads and or transportation in the Amazon and urban centers in the Amazon, but not necessarily the area of extraction itself. So the idea of state-led industrialization is a shortcut. The idea was to reduce the unequal exchange between the periphery and core countries, basically to raise the wage levels of Latin American workers and put them more on par with workers in industrialized countries, North America, Western Europe, which would increase their purchasing power and then hopefully even out the development process. So they were focusing on interweaving industries with extensive backward-forward linkages, specifically steel, petrochemicals, dams, highways, ports, railroad, all these things that can really contribute to economies of scale. So this is 30 years in one slide. We'll say that there was a very true diversification of industry. Some industries were founded at the time that maybe didn't perform so well, but now have become leaders in their field. I'm thinking of Embraer, some of the ethanol production, some of the IT, some of the specialized agriculture that BNDES founded in the 60s and 70s, and by the time the 90s rolled around, they were really starting to become leaders in their field. But one of the main problems, and this is a problem with lots of ISI policies at the time, was there's a willingness to not export too much because they saw exporting your commodities as just contributing to this underdevelopment process. But within that, there was an export bias, problems with inflation. Lots of countries, or Brazil frequently had bad terms of trade, which led to deficiencies in foreign exchange reserves. And it was common that they would tax the agriculture that they did export, they would tax heavily to fund industrialization, which sort of pitted rural elites versus urban elites. And so that created a lot of political tension. But by the time the debt crisis hit in 1982, with Brazil getting emergency loans from the IMF with structural adjustment policies attached to them, one of the first things they did was change the some of their export policy to bring in more foreign exchange earnings. So very quickly, BNDES started funding export, or I should say agro-export industry, which gets to sort of what Gisel touched on is the relationship between government funding with industrial agriculture in Brazil. That's been going on for a while now. And so we see that in 1982, 1983, 1991, and 2003, there's been new agencies founded that just exist to provide equity and loans to agro-export businesses. And so, which is interesting that we're now in neoliberalism, and the private sector should be, from the paradigm as we know it, the state should have really backed off. But what has been the case was, since the 50s, for those of you that know Brazil, it's had frequent problems with inflation. And because of this, there's been pretty serious problem with the development of a private capital market. So BNDES has always been there as a sort of state capital market, which, in addition to inflation, has sort of stunted the development of a private capital market. And so when these industries are being privatized, as in 1990, some of the steel industries, electricity, petrochemicals, they didn't have a private capital market to turn to get funding, so they turned to BNDES. So BNDES is still playing a very central role with how the private sector operates, which I find pretty interesting. And so in addition to that, BNDES was responsible for privatizing a lot of these industries. Let's see. So within that, there's been, under Cardoso, he brought a more coherent approach to industrial policy that laid the foundation for what Lula has implemented in the 2000s. Lula and Dilma's extended it in terms of controlling inflation. All these policies that have allowed Brazil's growth could not have been possible if inflation was still out of control in the thousands of percentage points. So Cardoso really laid the foundation for this, creating BNDES, strengthening the role in the economy here. And Lula's really extended it. As I mentioned before, these exports have grown from 33 million 91 to 13 billion 2010. I just discovered this yesterday. This Brazil Maior plan that was put in place to help facilitate the survival of some of the export industries that have been severely hit by the appreciancy of their currency, so that way they can continue to be competitive. And so this is for some very basic commodities, sugar, pulp, but it's also for things like footwear and some light appliances. And as we can see, in the last 15 years, exports have really improved, as well as the volume of exports has really increased, in addition to their technological intensity. Obviously, commodities have really increased, just very basic commodities, basic agricultural products, but as well as high-tech goods, low-tech goods, medium-tech. And right now, Brazil is trading or exporting at the largest volume it ever has in history. And it's also exporting the most technologically advanced products that it's ever had in history. So it's a very interesting, and BNDES has played a very central role in promoting certain industries. But along with all of this comes, and I just remember this in Gisel's talk, is that this exerts very heavy environmental pressure. Consumption has increased considerably in Brazil. Poverty has been halved, I believe, but along with that becomes increased personal consumption. You're eating more meat, more of everything. So that leads to more cattle grazing and more farming and higher demand for water. And so there's another side to this. Some of it's highlighted with very high-profile projects like the Belo Monte Dam, But there, yeah, this is really, it's good, but it's you have to look at how to balance every aspect of it. I think I'll skip that. This is sort of how the skeleton of how BNDES functions within the Brazilian government. It's actually a very independent agency. It doesn't necessarily have to respond to its superiors, I should say. It gives it a lot of freedom. The headquarters is not even in Brasilia. And so what happens generally is that we'll say that the Ministry of Agriculture comes up with a project they want to implement. They submit it to the Casa Civil, which is a step below the presidency. The chief of staff of the presidency is the head of the Casa Civil, which is sort of considered the highest, next to the president, it's the highest office you can have. The chief of staff approves it, and oftentimes will just pass it to BNDES, either to fund the project, or to execute the project, or to just simply fund it. Even if they're just funding it, they've still got a hand in how the project is going to be applied. So there's a very wide activity with BNDES within the government. And some of the industrial policy that has been occurring within BNDES, we can see there's another export agency, some well, someone could argue with this, but a coherent industrial policy, and which way that Brazil wants to take its industrialization. And Gisel touched on this, the PAC programs, the Program for Acceleration and Growth. Lula implemented it in 2007 with about 300 billion spending over the next 3 years. And I bring this up because BNDES is one of the funders of it. If not, it's the main funder for it, and one of the main people that execute the project. So it's a lot of investment in infrastructure, key industries, as you can read those, energy, transportation. He extended it in 2010 before he left office, well into the Dilma administration, almost 900 billion in very similar investments. Within that, the 2014 World Cup coming up in Brazil, BNDES has got a, we'll call that $3 billion in a budget to build stadiums, to build hotels, whatever transportation that cities need to support the World Cup. In Fortaleza, I believe there's a metro leaving from one of the airports to the stadium, the new stadium, which hasn't been built. The ground hasn't been broken, I don't think. That's another discussion. But anyway, all of this has been boosting demands for construction commodities. Yeah, we can see here that Brazil's foreign aid commitments. Oh, I don't need to discuss that. But some concluding thoughts here to wrap it up. As I said, the state has played a very integral role in every economic trend of the last 50 years, including neoliberalism. One of the problems that I believe it's a problem is the absence of a private capital market in terms of the state not having such an integral role in how the economy is going to be playing out. Not just, well, especially in terms of innovation, what projects get funded. But this probably won't be resolved in the near future. Everything I've read indicates that Dilma is going to continue expanding BNDES. Some critics think that BNDES is just getting out of hand, that it's dispersing so much money that it's just taking on its own role, and that it's going to be hard to bring it in. Another question I'm considering is, to what degree has regulatory capture occurred? How much patronage is occurring? And this also touches on what Gisel mentioned. Is BNDES funding political opponents just to placate them? How are people lobbying to receive money for projects? How are those projects being implemented? BNDES has invested in so many projects that it's kind of hard to track, and it's kind of confusing if you spend too much time looking at it. And one other thing, now that Brazil has got so many MNCs internationally, how active will the state be to protect those interests in terms of foreign policy? Brazil's role as a foreign diplomat is increasing considerably, and so I think that's one more question that needs to be looked at in the future. And I believe that's all I have.
Questions for either or both speakers?
I'd like to just quickly interject something that neither one of us mentioned, or that's sort of key to understanding both of our things, is that Dilma, the current president of Brazil, was the first head of the PAC that's connected to both of our projects, this like purse strings. So she's totally invested, no pun intended, in this this working this new way of doling out money in Brazil for this project. So there's no surprise that she's continuing this relationship. Yeah.
Have you witnessed production of soybean competing against black beans?
Have I witnessed? No.
No.
That's another great topic. Write that down. Soybeans. Soybeans, China. Yeah, I'm actually working some with the soybeans in the project that I'm doing with Professor.
Feijoada, the soybeans are good.
Or yeah. We were really clear on this. Yeah.
Just a question, who is the head of the team there? How do you get there? I mean, is it government appointed?
Yeah. I believe he's appointed by the chief of staff. He used to be a finance minister. I think he was the head of the central bank. His name is Luis something. It's not. I can't recall his name, but it's easy to find. He's got interviews and everywhere.
So he moved up the ranks sort of through the different government agencies and then president of the
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I didn't really understand what regulatory capture is.
Oh, okay.
A term that I should know, but I don't.
Well, I guess that would be if the government is able to make independent decisions, or decisions independent of private sector interests, in terms of, right, how much are the people receiving the project money from BNDES? How much are they influencing the person, the people above them that are making the decisions? Yeah.
In terms of like neoliberal politics and BNDES,
Mm-hmm.
like as a government agency, how is it like that impactful on neoliberalism? Because I see that as being one of the policy, like with just trade between corporations and whatnot, and like the kind of the government taking a step back, but then as like the agency, how does that work?
Well, it gets to decide what businesses get funded and what businesses don't get funded. And so there tends to be, I guess, accusations that sometimes that's not it's not like meritocracy. So, I mean, I guess the idea with neoliberalism is that the state sort of just is there to create the foundations for the market. But in this case, the state is playing an active role in dictating market directions and investment incentives and things like this.
As far as the private capital, are there not a lot of foreign governments or foreign companies, American companies, investing in Brazil and trying to be part of this? There's not.
Yeah, BNDES, it brings in foreign capital. You can invest in it.
It's just
if
not
you'd like.
in comparison to BNDES. It's not.
It's much smaller, the amount of money that they bring in. Yeah.
In that line,
It was Nick.
So it seems to me there's a sort of inherent contradiction between the two of your presentations. And so Ian, you're telling this story of BNDES sort of helping the Brazilian economy along throughout its tenure, in some ways mitigating the global recession or the effects of the global recession, right? And really increasing the power of this Brazilian Brazilian economy over time. And I'm sorry, I don't.
Giza.
You're talking about on the sort of from the ground up the problems with a lot of these infrastructure projects that's being funded by the PAC, right?
Right.
So I'm just wondering how the two of you sort of resolve these perspectives, right? Because in some certain ways, maybe as a national economy thing, the bank is doing good things for Brazil, but then if you look on the ground, it's impacting people in some way, sometimes not beneficial ways. So I was just wondering if maybe the both of you could share thoughts on that.
I tend to agree that all of this development is happening, and that the Transposição do Rio São Francisco is part of that. And I mean, they're putting their construction caps out, and they're going out, and they have jobs building this thing, and there is water going to be diverted into these arid regions. So, on a certain sense, there is this development, and it all happens so that it can show up on a spreadsheet, and people can say, look at what I accomplished. But as far as people's point of view, was it worth it? What have we sacrificed for that? What was the process to get here? It could all turn out really well. I mean, small farmers really could benefit from this project, but the opposition is saying, we don't necessarily want you to stop every large project, but you need to come and ask us if you're kicking us off our land, or if you're polluting our water, or if you're not revitalizing this river that's been compromised and now you're going to divert it. So I think of it as sort of parallel to everything that's happened in this country after 9/11. We're all safer, right? We've got more.
A sample of some of the Brazilian multinationals that are operating throughout the world. There are in total 300 some. I don't have the number here, but and they're from diverse sectors: pharmaceuticals, food, engineering, and IT, pulp, paper, mining, chemistry, aeronautics. So there's a huge mix of primary commodities with highly specialized commodities. So that was the punchline. Now let me start back in the early 1900s. One of the reasons that BNDES came to be so prominent was that in the 1950s, after World War II, the Brazilian government was very eager to industrialize, overcome this legacy of dependency. They wanted to have a diverse. We see that BNDES is still playing a really strong role as a financier to the private sector and really dictating some of the actions of the private sector. Which brings us to now with the post-Washington consensus, Southern consensus. I don't think there's a name yet for where we're at, but BNDES in the 2000s, under Lula, now under Dilma, is playing a really strong role in Brazil's economy, as I'll discuss quickly. You see here the disbursements over the last 14 years have continued growing and growing. You see a spike in 2008, likely because of the financial crisis. Analysts have been saying that one of the reasons that Brazil was one of the last countries in the crisis and one of the first countries out of the crisis was because the bank increased their lending and was not willing to let the economy slow. Since are impressive. It was founded in 1952, and since then you can't analyze Brazil's industrialization without looking at the role the bank has played. And then I also found it very interesting the way that the bank has frequently transformed itself, or policymakers have pushed it to transform, depending on whatever particular political economic paradigm was popular at the time. ISI, import substitution industrialization. BNDES was this typical ISI institution, this sort of state-led, industrialized policy, this kind of shortcut to industrialization. So the state was a really heavy actor. And when we have the transition to neoliberalism, where the idea is that the state really backs off and the state is just there to sort of provide support to the private sector. Talking about this development bank called the BNDES. This was wrote this with an eye on commodities and the way that commodities have played a historical role in the development or underdevelopment of countries in Latin America, in this case Brazil. So what is this bank, BNDES? Stands for National Bank for Social and Economic Development. It is currently the largest development bank in the world. 2010 disbursements doubled those of the World Bank, although it does engage in different types of lending. For instance, BNDES lends primarily to domestic projects within Brazil or to Brazilian multinationals operating throughout the globe, whereas the World Bank functions a bit differently. But nonetheless, I think that the numbers. Since then, it's sort of just kept going, which the critics in Brazil like to point out. But we can see also that, like coming out of import substitution industrialization, there is now a big emphasis on exports and diversified manufactured exports. And BNDES has been very instrumental in funding projects or funding businesses that export, funding innovation to create industrialized exports. So there's it increased 100-fold from 1991 to 2000. Currently, this export and import bank subsidiary of BNDES is now at $13 billion. So since 91, it's increased 400-fold. And we see here the